How could one disease eradicate 1/3 of Europe's population and up to 200 million people worldwide? The bubonic plague spread so fast, no one was prepared to face it. But why was no one prepared? What have we learned to help us survive the COVID-19 pandemic? It's 1346, and the people of Kaffa in Crimea wake up to a terrifying sound: the Mongol Tatar army. The Crimean people knew they couldn't withstand the Mongol attack, and were expecting the worst. But something was off. Many of the Tatar soldiers were sick, barely able to stand up. They were on the other side of the wall, too weak to penetrate the fortress. But they had an idea. What if we catapulted infected over the wall into Kaffa? This was the beginning of the horrifying Black Death outbreak in Europe. Some years ago, the rats in the empty Mongolian steppes started migrating towards towns in search of food. The rats had fleas in their fur, and the fleas carried a bacteria, YERSINIA pestis. That's right, it's because of these tiny bacteria that 1/3 of Europe died within a decade.
After every sweep of the plague, each population center would have lost at least 40% of its citizens. Sometimes the death tolls climbed as high as 70%.
We also need to remember that not all people lived like kings and queens in the Middle Ages. In fact, most people lived in a constant state of poverty and conflict. Europe had just seen the Great Famine in 1315-17, which had destroyed up to 1/10 of the population. Many poor families lived in single rooms, dark, cold, and humid. Animals would share this room too, along with the stored food. People worked all day long, from the age of 5 until their deaths, and the conditions were, well, suboptimal. Cities didn't have sewage systems, human waste and dead animals were a common sight in the streets, and personal hygiene was something to be desired. Most people could only wash with a bucket of cold water, and this wouldn't happen every day. They never brushed their teeth, and their hair was often full of fleas and lice. Indeed, some scientists believe it was human fleas rather than rat fleas that made the plague spread as fast as it did. Human fleas spread the pneumonic plague, which infects the lungs and made bubonic plague deadlier. Historians also point to the fact that this was a very religious and superstitious time when people thought women were witches and cats were evil. People started culling the cat population, which led to a surge in the rat population. These were harsh times for humans and animals worldwide. Still, no one was ready for the terrifying symptoms of the bubonic plague. First, there was a fever, weakness, and a persistent headache. Then the extremities would develop necrosis, and buboes would appear around the neck and groin, painful, inflamed lymph nodes. The plague could also manifest itself as the pneumonic plague, affecting the lungs, or the less frequent septicemic plague, affecting the bloodstream and causing almost certain death. None could be found to bury the dead for money or friendship, and they died by the hundreds both day and night. As soon as the ditches were filled, more were dug. There were also those who were sparsely covered with earth, and the dogs dragged them forth and devoured many throughout the city. There was no one who wept for any death, for all awaited death. It's difficult to believe that the Black Death came with any silver linings, but it did. And many of the advancements that came as a result of it are the reason we are now surviving the COVID-19 pandemic. French coastal cities learned that ships were the greatest spreaders of the Black Death. They created a quarantine, a 40-day period that the people on the ships had to stay in isolation for before docking. European societies started seeing the importance of doctors and hospitals, so knowledge in medicine surged within a century. This was the beginning of the Renaissance. But the bubonic plague was never gone for good. Between 1665 and 1666, 100,000 people fell to the plague in London, 1/4 of the population at the time. In 1855, China saw an extremely aggressive plague outbreak, claiming the lives of 10 million people in India alone. Madagascar still sees plague outbreaks today, but the disease is easily curable with vaccines and antibiotics. However, the bubonic plague was not the last devastating global pandemic. In the 16th century, Spanish invasions brought smallpox to the Americas, destroying 90% of the native population. This led to the fall of the Aztec and Inca civilizations. And then there's another familiar enemy, the flu. Between 1918 and 1919, 4 waves of the Spanish flu infected 500 million people, about a third of the world's population at the time, a population already weakened and exhausted after World War I. Its death toll was so big that we only have vague estimates between 20 and 100 million people, more lives than World War I had claimed. The Spanish flu, or influenza, got its name only because Spain was a neutral country during the war, and its press was free to report this pandemic. Patient alpha of influenza is still unknown. Studies within the last decades picked pigs, then birds as potential animal hosts. But the lack of evidence of a decrease in the pig or bird population in 1918 suggests that there is another unknown explanation. The flu was actually first reported in Camp Funston, Kansas in March 1918. Large groups of soldiers moving across the continent spread the virus quickly, and more reports of respiratory illnesses appeared around the globe. In July 1918, it seemed like the influenza outbreak was coming to an end, but this was just the first wave. By August, the virus had mutated into an even deadlier one. It started from 3 ports: Boston, USA, Brest, France, and Freetown, Sierra Leone. On November 11, 1918, the conflict was over, but this news was as good as it was bad. Hundreds of thousands of men returned home carrying a deadly virus inside their lungs. A postal worker in Plymouth, Massachusetts wrote to his wife, "Dear Ruth, I have some more bad news to write you. If things keep on by the end of the year, there will be nobody left in town. In Brockton, 3 days last week, there was a funeral every hour." On October 31, 1918, the mayor's office in San Francisco recommended the use of masks as a means to stop the spread of influenza. 3 days after implementing the law, cases in San Francisco dropped by 50%. This is no surprise today, but in 1918, it was a medical breakthrough. 2 more influenza waves followed in 1919, but they were less severe, partially due to the achievement of herd immunity. Indeed, by 1920, the global population had achieved immunity to the virus, which is why there are no more Spanish flu outbreaks today. Several flu viruses are circulating in the human and animal populations almost all the time. Few are as deadly as the Spanish flu. This type A, H1N1 virus caused an acute viral infection, destroying the tissue of the lungs. This often led to a bacterial infection such as Streptococcus pneumoniae. Influenza has a strange choice of victims, claiming the lives of those under 5 and young people between 20 and 40 years old. While there is no official explanation for this, one theory is that the older generations had been exposed to one of the 3 previous flu waves of the 19th century. Without a vaccine or antibiotics for the bacterial infections, control efforts against influenza were limited to quarantine, good personal hygiene, and limitations on public gatherings. In 2004, the Harvard School of Public Health did a study on the transmissivity of the virus and on ways to prevent it.
In their estimation, a similar pandemic could be prevented by vaccinating or administering antiviral prophylaxis to 50 to 75% of the population.
Sound familiar? Indeed, when the coronavirus pandemic broke out in late 2019, no one was prepared for it. Coronaviruses are human pathogens, first discovered in the 1960s. There are 7 coronaviruses discovered, and most of them are very common and don't require a vaccine. Sometimes coronaviruses that infect animals mutate and get transmitted to humans. This is what happened in the case of COVID-19, also known as SARS-CoV-2. General consensus is that the virus emerged from the wet markets in Wuhan, where live bats and pangolins are sold. National health systems and universities worldwide had to act quickly to develop an effective cure for COVID-19, but making a vaccine isn't a walk in the park. When Edward Jenner created the first vaccine against smallpox in 1798, he faced many barriers, securing funding, streamlined manufacturing, and safety concerns, and public fears of inoculating agents. All of these barriers are present today. After the first signs of the virus in December 2019, scientists isolated the virus and sequenced its genome within a month. But they had to pass several trials, obtain funding for production and distribution, and earn the public's trust. While Thailand's population is the most willing to take a vaccine, with only 6% refusing, studies in France and Poland show that almost 40% of their population are unwilling to get vaccinated. The world has learned a great deal about preventing a global pandemic. Science and medicine have evolved just a bit in the last few centuries. Historian YUVAL Harari explains that despite the discouraging death toll, humanity is much more prepared to face a pandemic today. Many people believe that the terrible toll coronavirus has taken demonstrates humanity's helplessness in the face of nature's might. In fact, 2020 has shown that humanity is far from helpless. Epidemics are no longer uncontrollable forces of nature. Science has turned them into a manageable challenge. And there is another aspect that makes us more prepared today. Digital surveillance can track the infection rates, and lockdowns don't lead to economic ruin thanks to the internet. For thousands of years, 90% of the world's population worked in agriculture. A lockdown, even a short one, would lead to mass starvation. Now, most of the food production is mechanized, and the 1.5% of the US population who works in farming produce food exported worldwide. With its ups and downs, the current economy was able to survive, while education and work continued online for prolonged periods. After the Black Death, humanity developed medicine by creating hospitals and learning surgery. After smallpox, humanity developed the vaccine. When the Great Flu came, masks and better personal hygiene. How will the world look after COVID-19?
That completely depends on our choices. One big choice is whether we deal with this crisis through nationalistic isolation, each country competing with all the others for the scarce resources, or whether we deal with it through international solidarity and cooperation, and which this will shape not just the crisis, but also the world for years to come.
How do you think humanity has changed in the aftermath of its global pandemics? Are we prepared for the bleak event of another pandemic? What should be the lessons of COVID-19? Drop us your thoughts in a comment, and while you're at it, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and check out our other videos.